On to, I guess, our other one. Real quick, we're going to run through this game because this is, again, two teams that we don't know much about based on week one. Georgia and Notre Dame. I'm super interested in this game because Notre Dame doesn't usually, even though they have such a varied schedule since they're not beholden to a specific conference schedule, they don't tend to dip into the SEC very often. But to their credit, they do schedule these primetime big games when programs are really good. They don't if they catch a team that's a good name team that sucks, it's not because they were trying to line up an easy game. It was just because that's how the cards fell. So let me know in this one, what do you think about these two teams, and is this a new Notre Dame team? I mean, they kind of blew Temple out of the water last week. Nobody saw that coming. And how do they match up against what's probably a pretty salty SEC defense?
Well, I think the first thing you have to understand is that Temple lost everybody that made Temple Temple last year. Um, Matt Rule took the job down at Baylor. Didn't really have a great opening week himself at Baylor last week. But uh, Temple, Temple lost as many guys as anyone else in the country. Again, and I was flipping through these rankings, and this was why I did confirm. Appalachian State was 67th in Athlon's preseason, and Temple was 81st. And I'm not sure how many people realize that Temple, who only had four returning defensive starters, four returning offensive starters, eight total returning starters is pretty darn low. That Temple was as depleted as they were. And I say this just because for whatever level that Georgia struggled early with App State, you have to keep in mind that App State was actually a better opponent than Temple was, or at least probably is. And so, with all that said, I think that these teams have a lot of similar strengths. They both have a new quarterback now that's going to be starting this game. Interestingly, they both had pretty similar stat lines and QB ratings. Fromm was a 89.5 QBR. Wimbush was an 84 QBR. I think they both have pretty strong rushing attacks. And, I think neither team had the season they wanted last year. Georgia was a lot closer than Notre Dame was. But the question to me really in most of these games is how much can either team hold up to the physicality of the other. And for Notre Dame, one of the telling things to me is that they're going to have 3 or 4 guys that started last year that have been demoted to backups. And what that always tells me is, however the team was last year, and we said this in the previews, right? The thing I want to see, if you were not very good last year, or that you had some areas of weakness like Notre Dame defensively, I want to see guys that started lose their jobs to guys that did not start or new young players, because that tells me that you knew that whatever talent deficiencies you've had, you have guys that were at least better than whatever those deficient spots were the year before. And it's not just a matter of graduating players, but you've simply found a way to improve. Guys get older, they do get better, but you can only make so much of a jump. And when you see guys getting passed into the depth chart, that's when you have a real sign that players have gotten a lot better. So, I mean, going into this game, it's to me, I think the first big question is, just Georgia's offensive line take the step forward they need to establish the run game, because in the Appalachian State game, they had the run game going pretty well, but it wasn't dominant, right? I mean, you kind of expect with an opponent of the caliber of App State that Nick Chubb and Sonny Michel are just going to kind of take that game over. And to some degree they were good. They were like the 6 yard per carry range. But that's not completely dominant. And I think you'd like to have seen them be more like, 7, 8 yards of carry against somebody like App State. It is the opener. Things will get better. But the other concern here is you saw from a lot of inconsistency with his decision-making in the passing game. He's quick to pull the trigger. He's a very accurate guy, but how is he going to react to actually playing a secondary where, and I think this is the toughest thing for a young quarterback to understand. Sometimes the best play is not throwing the football. And it doesn't matter how accurate you are and how good your arm talent is. There may be nowhere on the field that you can throw the football that isn't going to be dangerous. And it may be that you are not going to have enough time to throw the football, even if there was. So that's kind of my first question. But that same extension can be made of Wimbush at Notre Dame. Um, I do think Georgia's physicality in the front seven is probably going to shock Notre Dame to some extent, because this is still a Notre Dame team that got whipped on physically at times last year. In fact, it wouldn't shock me if in some ways Notre Dame is less physical than App State. I mean, there's again a lot of injuries and guys coming back healthy, but that may be a possibility. I think a lot of it, honestly, if you haven't gotten this from this long discussion here, a lot of it's just up in the air. A lot of it's going to be what these teams look like because we don't really know. But I don't know. It's an exciting football game with two young quarterbacks making their first meaningful start. And I think Georgia was just the better team last year, has more proven physicality and talent defensively, has a much more proven run game than Notre Dame. And I that gives me to me that's a little bit of an edge to Georgia. But we'll see.
I think this game for me, I don't know that Georgia has an offensive edge, namely because what we saw last year down the stretch was, yeah, you've got some talent at running back, but when everybody in the building knows you can't throw it, at some point they'll find a way to stop you. Kind of like the same thing we saw with Florida last year too. So my concern is if they don't have production from the quarterback like they need, then eventually Notre Dame will be able to shut down their run game. But what I think on the other side of the ball, kind of what you alluded to, I don't know that Notre Dame is going to be used to seeing defenses as good as we think Georgia's defense is. And we think it because, like everything else we've talked about this week, we're still in that theory phase of SEC football or in college football in general. But we know that Georgia has recruited really well. We know that Kirby Smart can field a defense. And we know that they had a good defense last year. Maybe not an elite defense, but a good defense. And Notre Dame struggled with bad teams and bad defenses. So I think, like you said, the physicality, the speed, and the ability on the defense really puts this one in Georgia's favor. I'm not ready for picks yet because I want to hear you give me a little more analysis on this game. But I could see this being one of those games where Georgia beats them pretty bad, but it's because of a couple of turnovers and maybe a special team snafu or something here or there where their offense doesn't really produce a ton, but they still end up with 28, 30 points.
Yeah, I think so. And to me, the biggest thing is I don't know that Notre Dame's going to be able to handle Georgia's physicality in the run game. Um, Quietly, one of the interesting things about Appalachian State is last year Appalachian State's total and scoring defense was about 50. It was 50th to 60th in the country. But in terms of rushing yards per game, passing yards per game, Appalachian State was 10th in the country in rush defense and 105th in pass defense. We don't know how much continuity that's going to really carry over to this year because we have a one game sample, but odds are App State is probably a lot better at stopping the run than stopping the pass. In fact, it may turn out that they're a very good rush defense because they did return their leading tackler. On the flip side, Notre Dame last year, the reason they were so bad was that they were 80th in the country in rush defense. So, given that Georgia has a new starting quarterback and that Georgia returns Nick Chubb and Sony Michel and most of their offensive line, I've got to think the fact that they went, I know they went from App State to Notre Dame, but they went from a team that was 10th in the country last year in rush defense to a team that was 80th in the country in rush defense. And for that reason, I think Georgia is going to be able to establish the run. And they're going to be able to bring their physicality to play. And the moment you can do that and you can lean on a team and put pressure, is the moment that you sort of see what the other team's made of. And it's going to be hard for Notre Dame to really completely shake, I think, sort of the lack of physicality as a persona that they've had under Brian Kelly. And I think that's going to be a little too much. And I think this game's going to get away from them, frankly.
So, how much of this, because we've heard Brian Kelly, after Notre Dame lost to Alabama in the national championship game a few years ago, Brian Kelly went on the record running his mouth like he's known to do, saying basically that the game wasn't that fair because Notre Dame can't ever recruit like an SEC school, which I think is kind of interesting given the fact that yes, Notre Dame does have elevated academic standards, but they're always in like the top 10 in recruiting. Like they always get like they get their share of those guys who both have good grades and have physical ability. But Georgia is, I think, on a little bit of another level in recruiting. So let's say this game goes how both of us are kind of indicating that we think it might. Let's say Georgia wins this game and it's not a dogfight and they win it kind of easy. How much, give me a percentage out of 100, how much is that due to Notre Dame not being able to recruit on the level of Georgia, and how much of it is that Notre Dame isn't getting the coaching that they need to play with a Georgia?
I think if Georgia runs away from this game the way we're talking, I honestly think it's going to be 80% talent. Now, you said, how much, there's a nuance here, right? You asked how much of it is going to be due to Notre Dame not being able to get the players. I don't think it's because Notre Dame can't get the players that they want. I think they just don't get the players that they need. Rick did recruit pretty darn well. Kirby Smart recruited phenomenally and looks like he will continue to recruit at a phenomenal clip. They're just more talented than Notre Dame. And I am not sold that Notre Dame is coached that great. Like we said, they're built to do this finesse style of offense. I don't know that they can play physical football the way they need to. But also, to be honest, I'm not so sold on how well coached Georgia is after watching them the past couple of years. Um, so anytime you talk about one team is just going to overpower the other, it to a certain degree you have to condition the players, train them, institute a physical mindset. But once you get to a certain level, the rest of it is just talent taking over, right? Um, you know,
But how much of that is talent, the actual bodies they recruited out of high school, and how much of it is coaching up talent or not coaching up talent once they get it there? I feel like Georgia has a little more room to breathe and more margin for error there in terms of maybe not coaching up all the talent they had. I think that's why Rick is no longer there. But I also feel like there is something to be said because you can't tell me that Notre Dame lost to 8 teams last year that were all more talented than they were in terms of actual Jimmys and Joes.
I would agree with that. They're too talented to play at the level they were. They had no business whatsoever going 4-8 last season. Now, that's interesting too, right? Because of that 4-8 record, um, there's only one game all year that they lost by more than a score, and that was the finale against Southern Cal that ended up in the Rose Bowl. So,
You also had another interesting point, though, about that 4-8 record relative to the Browns' new starting quarterback. Why don't you touch on that as well?
yeah, and we had this discussion before, but it was when I sent you a text when Cleveland Browns named Deshaun Kaiser the starting quarterback. My point was, wow, man, how rough is it when you go 4-8 and you had a instant starter first round draft pick quarterback at the helm? Like teams,
Everybody's going to say it's the Browns, but he's beating out players that have been in the NFL, that have started games in the NFL, that have been there for years. So I'm with you, man. I didn't really think about it until you phrased it that way, but you go 4-8 against that schedule with that the piece that everybody wants the most in college football, right, is quarterback. There's such a dearth of talent at quarterback. You had that, and you still could only muster 4 wins. That was some pretty good insight.
yeah. So I don't know. I mean, and it all comes down to right the surrounding talent, like we're talking about. Um, I think evaluation is an issue. I think some degree coaching up's an issue because the guys just aren't physical and they're not willing to be able to put their talent, to use the way they should. But the rest of it, I don't know. I don't think the academic thing has a ton of merit. Stanford recruits plenty well, and the truth is, in current day and age, student athletes I think are a lot more aware of things than they used to be. And I think honestly, the academic prestige, even though it limits the talent pool, I think it's a huge draw to recruits now. I mean, there's a lot of guys going to Stanford and going to UCLA because they are elite academic institutions. And schools are really using their academics as a recruiting tool now. Um, so, Notre Dame, I think, should, as much as they lose, there's some guys that because they know some guys aren't going to be able to pass calculus and they're not going to take them because there's no way they can stay qualified. And I get that. But there's also plenty of kids that when you're recruiting against Georgia, you can just point to the university rankings and say, hey, we're Notre Dame, we're here. Well, the other problem
Yeah,
with
and
that,
it's also worth noting that student athletes, especially D1 football players, do not have the same academic requirements that the regular student body has to get accepted into a Notre Dame. Whereas I think it's like that across the board. I mean, it's just a sliding scale of what your academic requirements are, and I don't know if there's any conferences that accept partial qualifiers like they did back in the old days where Louisville would get everybody that Alabama couldn't get in the door. But the SEC doesn't have super high academic standards. But it is interesting to me where a lot of these schools, like Ohio State fans, they get in an argument with you because they got earholed by Clemson, or they can't win anything of significance anymore, and they'll be like, "Well, our academics are so much better." Yeah, but you recruited the same football players that Alabama did or that Clemson did, so don't wrap yourself in the flag of academia when your players got the same SAT scores and the same GPAs as the kids going to SEC. Now, Notre Dame, like you said, it's a double-edged sword in your favor and against. But for people that are listening that have heard this excuse before, keep in mind these players don't have to have, a 30 on the ACT and a 4.2 GPA to get into school. They have to have better than an SEC, but it's not like the average student going to Notre Dame.
right? Yeah, exactly. And they can take a relaxed schedule. The problem with Notre Dame is their mandatory curriculum and the university. There's a sliding scale for NCAA eligibility, but the school still has to approve you for admittance. Um, you know, the truth is everybody's pretty lax on that, but at some level, Notre Dame's not going to recruit a kid if he's an absolute borderline qualifier because they're just going to be questioning whether he can stay eligible. I'm going to take a little shot there and say, considering the fact that they keep having players plagiarize papers, I'm not really sure how hard it is to stay eligible at Notre Dame. But no, I mean, it's like you said, the end of the day, for the most part, they are recruiting the same kids, and you can make that excuse all you want, but yeah, most of Alabama's squad was recruited and offered by Ohio State. In fact, almost the entire squad. Same thing with Notre Dame and Georgia. I mean, I think the biggest thing really Notre Dame has going against it isn't any of this academic crap. It's the fact that they're a school in Indiana. They're near an Ohio State that's been extremely good. They're near a resurgent Michigan. And there's a lot of talent in the Midwest, but that talent, the best talent's all going to Ohio State for the most part.
Yeah,
Some of the
if
schools
I'm
got
going
some
to
other.
play in the if I'm going to play and practice in the cold, I'm going to at least want to have to take home some hardware at the end of the day. So that's kind of tough. All right, so this one's running long tonight, and as of this moment, Tennessee just went up 42-35, which is a far removal from where we were an hour ago, talking about this Tennessee team that had, I think, 7 points on the board. So anyway, SEC maybe coming out ahead in that one. Let's talk about scores in this game. Again, for those of you who don't know, we usually do computer model and then base our gut off of what we see in the computer model, and it tends to get really close. We don't have that luxury now because we don't have enough data. So we're still going off a bunch of unknowns. None of these teams that we're previewing this week played anybody of significance last week. So with saying all that, and I know you hate to do it, give me a gut score on Notre Dame and Georgia. Let me know what you think.
I think the score. I think the score is going to end up something like 41-17 Georgia. And I don't think the game, again, don't think the game is going to be that disparate. I just think the fact is that Georgia's a run first team. Notre Dame struggles with a run. And at some point, I think probably third or fourth quarter, this is going to be like a 24-17 game. and probably going around the time going into the fourth quarter, and Georgia's going to be able to run the ball to put it away, and Georgia's also going to be able to pin their ears back against the pass once they get up a couple scores, and basically stop Notre Dame from being able to do anything. We made a lot of scores like this. We got, I think we got like laughed out of the, out of the house when people were sitting there trying to watch our video with Alabama and Tennessee, and we said, I think it was like a one-loss Tennessee team was going to lose by like 4 touchdowns to Alabama. But we haven't necessarily been wrong too often with these. The reality is most college football games do not end up within one score. And it's often not because it's not that close. It's just that it's once a team gets momentum and starts getting rolling, particularly if they can run the ball well, the score does tend to get out of hand more often than not.
So I like your Notre Dame score, 17. I don't like your Georgia score, 41. I'm going to go 31, and I still think, again, I think that's not all on offense. I think we're going to see some defensive score or massively short field. I think something you said earlier in this preview touched on it for me, in that App State was last year a really bad pass defense team. Fromm comes in, has a pretty good showing, and everybody, I think, is giving him more credit than he probably, not that he deserves, but that it was a little bit of a mirage because he was facing a defense that maybe wasn't that much better than what he's used to in high school. I know that's wrong, but so I don't think he's going to be as comfortable in this game as he was coming in the last game. He's going to have to think about it all week. Yes, he's going to get those starter reps, but he's going to have it in his head all week. He's the guy. Sometimes it's a lot harder coming out as a starter than it is coming in as a reliever. So give me 31-17 Georgia. Either way, both of us think it's going to be a pretty comfortable win for Georgia, and that'd be a nice one, at least for the SEC to get one of those name out of conference wins. Anything else on this game before we close it out?
No, I don't think so. I think at the end of the day, people are going to look back at this one and overreact, because I think the reality of it is Georgia is going to be facing a team that's a lot better against the pass than App State was, and they're probably going to be facing a team that's actually a lot worse against the run. And I think everything that happens on offense for Georgia is probably going to be a result of that.
All right, y'all, that's it for us in week 2. Only 2 previews this week. Again, it was a pretty thin slate for the SEC. We probably got one more week of Husky and I picking from the gut, and then in week 4, we hope to have enough data that we can compile at least our first sort of raw computer model and get a little more nerdy with y'all on some of these stat-driven observations and projections. Thanks for sticking with us this far into the season. I know it's the second week, but sometimes we can get boring and y'all get bored and you drop off. So thanks so much for that. Again, remember, you can listen to the full-length audio for our weekly podcast. The links are in the description. Would love to hear your comments, your score predictions. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. God bless.